Hi everybody, thanks for clicking on my first devlog and first public video on YouTube. For the last 8 years or so, I've had this idea that I wanted to start working on, but with family, work, and school, it's been unrealistic to dedicate any real time to it. However, I've never really stopped thinking about it almost on a daily basis and sort of playing around with and refining different concepts. So nowadays I have a bit more time, so I thought I'd start working on it. It being something that I would consider reasonable and something that one person can make considerable progress towards. So to me, that sounds like an MMO. That's the fantasy, but in reality, I understand that what I'm proposing is like building the Death Star in my backyard. And if I continue with that analogy, so far with this devlog, I've put together an IKEA chair. But I'm really excited to see how far I can go. I'm pretty good at managing expectations, probably from being hardened in the software industry for almost a decade. That being said, my devlog series title is not completely accurate. I'm not fully a noob. I've been an engineer for a large tech company for most of my career. However, nothing to do with gaming. I worked on a few products from start to release. I also have a master's in computer science from a well-known university. In grad school, I took classes that were somewhat at a surface level preparing me for this project. Distributed systems, computer networks, advanced data structures, computer graphics, even a class on spatial sound. And the graphics class was my favorite. If I had to give a sort of a vision statement or just a high-level description of what the idea is, it would be that of a seasonal, community-driven hardcore MMO. Essentially, I would like something that's sort of a sandbox with an end to it. And I love the idea of factions warring over resources. We see this in quite a few games, but generally the incentive to fight for your faction or contribute in some way, even as a solo player, is one of perks. I know these systems go deeper than this, but a lot of times you'll see better buffs, as we would see in Crowfall, easier quest and grinding in WoW Classic on PvP servers, economic opportunities as we would see in, for example, New World. Well, I never played New World, but at least that's what I've heard. Or back in my day, for example, a game called RF Online, which had a really good mechanic for server-wide fights. I think it was every night. It's been a long time. But basically, winning this fight, I think it's called the Chip War, would give access to AFK gold generation. We even see games like RuneScape that have elements of this with clans holding down, wieldy areas. But I would like to see something that is a little different. Perhaps if your faction is dominated by another, you are maybe given an opportunity to find a home in another faction, one that didn't attack yours, or you are off the server. Eventually, there will be one faction that reigns supreme. I also really like the idea of faction XP. I feel like I've seen this somewhere, but I can't remember. Imagine something along the lines of, an individual can't make the best gear until the faction levels up to do so. I have no idea if in practice this would be amazing or absolutely flop. I have tons of semi-coherent ideas on paper, but I need to sit down and seriously trim the scope to make it somewhat more probable to get something running. As far as the art style, I would eventually aim for something that's like, I guess I would describe modern low poly. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but as most software engineers would say, I'm not an artist, but I do love certain types of low poly work. Not so much like, old school PlayStation 1 low poly, but something between Thin Matrix's game Equilinox and maybe Titan Reach, but maybe with a darker palette. Ultimately, I would need an art style that one person can iterate on quickly and isn't too complex. I really like live action combat styles like you would see in Darkfall and Holy Wars or even Crowfall. And I think ultimately I would avoid like a classic class system because it takes a lot of time, it seems, to create abilities and to do balancing. I'd probably aim for something more like RuneScape, where you have skills and different weapons, and those skills enhance those weapons. So for now, sort of done with the intro and the high-level concepts, although they don't give much clarity in actually what I'm thinking. But I think over time I'll be able to flush that out and represent that a little bit more clearly. But for now, I want to show a bit of the tasks I was working on and how I'm organizing what I'm actually doing. For managing my work, I've been using Trello, and I like it so far. It's pretty simple to use. It's free. That's pretty much everything I want. I think it's also pretty easy to collaborate in the future if I ever decided to do that. People can just jump on and see previous tasks, and I've been pretty diligent about keeping what I'm working on in the description or links or whatever readings and videos I've watched and whatnot. I've also added a power-up which has really been helpful. It allows you to easily record how much time you're putting per task, and I like that. It really is nice for staying motivated, actually, because sometimes you'll be working on a task and you get the impression that it's taking days because you're working on and off on it, but in reality it only took maybe a couple hours. In the done column, I have all the tasks in the order in which they were completed, and I started off with refreshing my memory around Rust. I had used it in the past for some tiny things, nothing in any real capacity, definitely nothing in production. And luckily, the Rust documentation is awesome. They have a great book to start off with, and there's some crash courses and things like that. From that, I worked on refreshing my memory around OpenGL. Again, I used it in the past a bit, and I thought about maybe working with Vulkan, but I really didn't want to overwhelm myself. Then I started learning about entity component systems, and these are some of the sources that I used for that. And then I tried to implement a very bare bones basic entity component system. I know that Rust has some crates for that. I think one is specs and maybe one is Bevy or Brevy, something like that. Then I started learning about this new file format, GLTF 2.0. And in the past, I'd used OBJ, STLs, Collada, a couple different file formats. And I heard about this one and I started reading about it, and it looks really awesome. So I implemented a little reader for that. And I know there's one in Rust already, but I wanted to kind of learn it a bit better. And then from there, started learning Blender. There's tons of material online for Blender and low poly modeling. And then I wanted to make a low poly model, which in my head seemed like it was going to be easier, but it was actually a bit more challenging than I thought. And then wanted to import into the game, which that was the easiest part. As you can see, it only took 5 minutes. And that's because when I implemented the reader, I also implemented reading in like a cube from Blender. So exporting in the same format, it was just a matter of changing the name of the file. As you can see, I've kept the scope pretty small, and I'll be trying to do that moving forward. In my career, I've seen that scope creep sort of gives momentary joy, but long-term headaches. And all these tasks, if you add them up, took me about 54.5 hours. Looking at the code, I'm not going to go over every line because I feel for most people that's pretty boring. Instead, I'm going to go over what I tried to achieve and some of the pain points. So I started with the entity component system, and again, very, very basic, just to learn the concepts of the design pattern. I tried to structure the entity component system in the most simple way possible, at least from a coding perspective. There's quite a lot of ways to code entity component systems, and there's actually a lot of scenarios where you'd want to use different data structures. In this case, I kind of did a one-size-fits-all approach. I set it up so there is an array for each type of component. The length of the arrays are based on the total number of entities. Think of it like a database table where the components would be the columns and the entities are the rows. The downside to this is you waste memory. In these arrays, the memory is still allocated for the size of the type. So in this case, even if there's no value there, you still would allocate and reserve space for it. So this doesn't scale necessarily well. So once we have the components set up, then we need a way to generate entities, which are essentially IDs, but in this case, more importantly, they're actually indexes into their respective component arrays, which I feel will cause problems in the future, but I will cross that bridge when I get there. After that, we just need a way to associate the entity with the components. And this brings me to my first pain point. You'll see that I have sort of C-style functions. This happened basically, I think, for two reasons. First being I don't know Rust well enough. And secondly, I can't really shake my object-oriented brain. Essentially, with Rust, you don't have the class hierarchy that you normally would have. So you don't have inheritance, and polymorphism is sort of different in Rust. So you have what are called trait objects. So essentially, you could define a trait that's called component, and each type of component could have that trait or implement that trait. And then you could use that trait to actually be sort of a binding on the parameters that you're passing into functions. But the problem is I couldn't find a way to easily match on those. So I would love to have just add component, and it could be any type of component, and inside that function in a local place you would have some sort of matching on those traits. Again, maybe there's a way to do that I don't know of, and I looked at other entity component solutions, and one of them seems to be doing something kind of like this, but it kind of looked like maybe compiler abuse that I don't know. So this brings me to my next pain point, which if you look here, you'll see that the components all clone the same cube data. So they have the mesh, the normals, text chords, all those things. The reason why that is, I would really love to have one mesh component and have entities be able to reference that same component. But the problem is something called interior mutability. And in C++ or in other languages, you don't really notice that you're doing this, but you have basically shared pointers to mutable state, which in Rust is a no-no. So there are ways around it. It looks like something called a ref cell, which is like described as dynamic borrow checking, which I don't quite know exactly what that is fully. I have a guess, but it seems like it kind of, I don't know, nullifies the benefit that you'd get from the compile time guarantees from the borrow checker, which I really like. So I'm a little hesitant to use those as of now, but I think with more experience, I'll probably be able to. So this brings me to my final part of the code that I wanted to show. So now that we have the components with the data, we have a way to associate entities and create entities. Now we just need the systems. So here's a couple examples of those. So this one just takes the transforms and it rotates them. And then you have the renderer, which kind of, again, very basic. And the OpenGL code is very vanilla, nothing special there. Basically getting all of the mesh and transform components and then checking which ones have both mesh and transform components, because in this case, that's what I'm looking for, and setting that transform as a uniform, and then binding and drawing the mesh. So if I can show this running real quick, I will do that. And you'll see I have 3 of these cubes, and I'm just rotating them around a little bit, and I have them offset to show the perspective. Now, since we saw the cube rotating, if I actually change which asset's being loaded, and then we run it again, we'll see that my model is now loaded. Moving forward, I have to sit down and scope out the next devlog. There's so many things I could work on, but I think I want to start working on shading, basic rigging, and animations. And I'm not sure when the next video will be out. This is really just a hobby, and I still can't put a ton of time into it each week. But, you know, if you made it this far, thanks for hearing me out. And if anyone wants maybe to chat, I can set up a Discord server. Just put a comment. Anyways, take care.